The 24-year-old mistress dropped a crumpled $1 bill onto my dinner plate. She smiled brightly as my husband announced to his cheering family that he had just legally sold our $10 million marital home to her for exactly that amount. They thought they were humiliating a poor, uneducated housewife who had nowhere else to go. They didn't know the house had belonged to me long before we were even married. And they certainly didn't know that the quiet woman sitting at the end of their table was the sole heir to a $50 billion global real estate empire, and that I was about to use that single dollar bill to legally, systematically obliterate their entire bloodline. Chapter 1: The $1 Insult. The dining room of the sprawling Los Angeles estate was filled with laughter. Sharp, ugly laughter, the kind that cuts through the air like broken glass. Julian Thorne stood at the head of the long custom mahogany table, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in his hand. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world. His family surrounded him, his mother Beatrice, his arrogant sister Camila, and his younger brother Leo. All of them dressed up in designer clothing, looking as if they were attending a coronation. But this wasn't a celebration. This was a funeral for my 5-year marriage, and they were joyfully dancing on its grave. I sat at the far corner of the table, perfectly quiet, my hands folded gently in my lap. I had spent 4 hours preparing that meal: roasted duck with rosemary, truffle-infused risotto, and a delicate artisan pastry Julian used to love. The table setting was immaculate. The food was flawless. But nobody thanked me. They never did. Julian cleared his throat, tapping his fork against his champagne flute. The room fell silent, the predatory anticipation palpable. Julian had that look in his striking blue eyes, that cruel, narcissistic satisfaction that blooms when an arrogant man believes he has finally trapped his prey. "I want to make an announcement," Julian said, his voice booming through the expansive modern room. "I am finally moving forward with my life. And to do that, I am transferring the deed to this house to someone who actually appreciates me. Someone who actually understands the high-stakes world of luxury real estate." Sitting directly beside him was Chloe. She was 24, a junior real estate agent at Julian's brokerage firm, always draped in designer logos, her bleached hair flawlessly blown out, her acrylic nails sharp and pointed. Somewhere between showing open houses and fetching Julian's coffee, she had decided to close a deal on my husband. Julian reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. For the sum of $1, Julian announced proudly, sliding the property deed across the polished wood toward Chloe, "This estate is officially yours, baby." The room erupted. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, jumped up from her chair and hugged Chloe as though she'd just won the Nobel Prize. Finally, Beatrice crowed, wiping away a dramatic, fake tear. "My son is finally free from that boring, uneducated deadweight." Camila, Julian's sister, raised her champagne glass, laughing loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceilings. "Elena never deserved this house anyway. She doesn't even know the difference between marble and quartz. She's just a glorified maid." Leo, the younger brother, stood up with a wide, malicious grin. "To new beginnings," he toasted, raising his glass, "to Julian finally getting the high-class life he deserves." I sat there, still as carved stone. My face was a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just watched them celebrate my supposed destruction as if I were watching a poorly written television drama. "Why isn't she crying?" Chloe whispered loudly to Julian, making sure her voice carried down the table to me. "Is she in shock?" Julian shrugged, a cruel, mocking smile never leaving his handsome face. "Because she knows she has absolutely nothing, Chloe. No rich family, no money, no power. She has nowhere to go. She's been living off my success for 5 years, and she knows it." Chloe giggled. She reached into her expensive Chanel purse, pulled out a crumpled, crisp $1 bill, and tossed it down the length of the table. It landed directly in the center of my dinner plate, soaking up the truffle sauce. "Here you go, Elena," Chloe sneered, her eyes glittering with venomous triumph. "Take that dollar. Go buy yourself a cheap cup of coffee from a gas station on your way to a homeless shelter." That's exactly what your 5 years of marriage are worth. I looked down at the soggy dollar bill. Then I stood up slowly. My movements were graceful, deliberate, entirely devoid of fear. "Excuse me," I said softly. My voice was so quiet they almost didn't hear it over their own self-congratulatory laughter. I reached out, picked up the crumpled dollar bill from my plate, wiped the sauce off it with a linen napkin, folded it neatly into a tiny square, and slid it into the pocket of my simple cashmere cardigan. Then I walked toward the guest bedroom, my footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floor. Behind me, the mocking celebration continued as if I had never existed at all. But what Julian didn't know, what the vicious little mistress didn't know, and what his entirely parasitic family was completely blind to, was that my silence was not surrender. It was the terrifying silence of a predator locking onto its target. They thought they had bought my life for $1. They didn't know I was about to use that exact same dollar bill to begin the total, systematic, and entirely legal annihilation of their existence. Chapter 2: The Shadow Empress. To understand the sheer catastrophic magnitude of Julian's mistake, you had to understand exactly who I was. 10 years ago, I didn't exist. At least, Elena the quiet housewife didn't exist. My real name was Elena Vanguard. I was the sole living heir to the Vanguard Real Estate Trust, a $50 billion global syndicate that practically owned the commercial and residential skyline of the American West Coast. My late grandfather, Arthur Vanguard, had built the empire from scratch. He was a ruthless, brilliant titan of industry who taught me everything about property acquisition, hostile takeovers, and the brutal mathematics of wealth. But he also taught me the most important lesson of all: true power never announces itself. The loudest person in the room is always the weakest. When my grandfather passed away, I inherited everything: thousands of commercial buildings, luxury residential high-rises, massive shopping conglomerates. I operated entirely through a complex web of anonymous LLCs and shell holding companies. My name was scrubbed from every public record. I was a ghost who moved billions of dollars with a single phone call. I wanted to build a life based on genuine connection, not transaction. When I met Julian 5 years ago, he was a struggling mid-level real estate agent with a lot of charm and zero capital. I hid my wealth. I played the role of a supportive, middle-class girl. I wanted to see if he could love me for me. He couldn't. As Julian began finding success I secretly orchestrated by funneling high-commission clients his way through proxy companies, his ego exploded. He became addicted to the illusion of his own brilliance. He started looking down on me, treating me like a stepping stone he had outgrown. And then he brought Chloe into my house. I sat in the dark guest bedroom of the Los Angeles estate, the muffled sounds of their laughter seeping through the walls. I pulled out my encrypted secondary phone, a device Julian didn't even know existed, opened my contacts, and pressed a single button. The line rang once. MS. Vanguard. A crisp, professional, heavily accented British voice answered immediately. It was Alastair Thorne, no relation, just a coincidence of surnames, chief legal counsel for the Vanguard Trust, commanding an army of the most vicious corporate litigators in the country. Alastair, I said, my voice dropping its soft domestic tone and adopting the cold, metallic edge of a billionaire CEO. It's time. I've been waiting for this call for 2 years, ma'am, Alastair replied smoothly, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. What are the parameters of the strike? Total, unrestricted liquidation, I commanded, staring at the crumpled dollar bill on the nightstand. Julian just tried to sell my house to his mistress for $1. Alastair let out a dry, chilling chuckle. He tried to sell 1420 Bel Air Road. The property you purchased in cash under Vanguard Alpha LLC 3 years before you even met him. Yes, I said. He forged a quitclaim deed, assuming that because his name is on the utility bills, he has marital equity. Fraudulent transfer of a multi-million-dollar asset, Alastair noted. That's a severe federal felony. Shall I call the authorities tonight? No, I said instantly. Arresting him now is too quick. Too merciful. I want to execute him in public. I want him to feel the exact moment his entire reality disintegrates. Understood, Alistair said. What's the primary target? Julian is Senior Vice President at Sterling and Associates Real Estate, I said. I want the Vanguard Trust to initiate a hostile takeover of the entire brokerage by tomorrow morning. Buy out the majority shareholders. I want to be his boss by the time he wakes up. Consider it done, Alistair typed rapidly. And his family? I leaned back against the headboard, my eyes narrowing in the dark. His brother Leo runs a high-end restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. His sister Camila owns a designer boutique in Beverly Hills. His mother Beatrice lives in a luxury condo in Santa Monica. I paused, letting the coldness settle into my bones. Check the property records, Alistair. I believe Vanguard Trust owns the commercial buildings where Leo and Camila lease their spaces. And I believe we hold the primary mortgage on Beatrice's condo building. I'm verifying now, Alistair said. A few seconds later, he hummed in confirmation. You have an excellent memory, MS. Vanguard. We own all 3 properties. Perfect, I whispered. Initiate immediate eviction protocols for breach of lease on the commercial properties. Double the HOA fees, and call the balloon payment on the mother's condo. I want them all financially suffocating within 7 days. It'll be a bloodbath, Alistair noted with a hint of professional admiration. And what about the mistress? Chloe? Chloe fancies herself a rising star in luxury real estate, I said, remembering the sneer on her face as she threw that dollar at me. She just opened her own boutique LLC last week using Julian's capital. I want you to freeze her operating accounts pending a federal investigation into the fraudulent transfer of the Bel Air house. Make sure she can't buy a cup of coffee without my permission. The trap is set, MS. Vanguard, Alistair confirmed. When do we trigger the collapse? In exactly 14 days, I said, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across my face. The Global Luxury Real Estate Summit is being held at the Los Angeles Convention Center. Julian and his entire pathetic family are attending to celebrate his success. We'll spring the trap there, in front of 3,000 people. I'll arrange the keynote speaking slot for you immediately, Alistair said. I hung up the phone. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't leave a note. I simply walked out the back door of the estate, stepped into a waiting black SUV, and disappeared into the night. Julian thought he had won. He thought he had buried a weak, defenseless woman for the cost of a single dollar. He was about to learn that the worst thing you can do to a quiet woman is underestimate her. Chapter 3: The Global Summit. 14 days later, the Global Luxury Real Estate Summit at the Los Angeles Convention Center was the absolute pinnacle of the industry calendar. Over 3,000 elite professionals, developers, billionaire investors, international brokers, media tycoons packed the massive, glittering venue. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, ambition, and ruthless money. Julian Thorne arrived looking like a king stepping into his newly conquered territory. He wore a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than some people made in a year, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. On his arm was Chloe, in a skin-tight, aggressive red Alexander McQueen dress that screamed for attention. She looked like a woman who believed she'd successfully climbed to the top of the social ladder. Julian's entire family had come to witness his supposed triumph. Beatrice wore her finest Chanel suit, chin tilted up, looking proudly out at the sea of wealthy faces. Camila and Leo flanked her, laughing loudly, acting as if they were already part of the billionaire elite. This is where the real players operate, Chloe, Julian said, his chest puffed out as they walked through the grand lobby. Millionaires, moguls. This is my world now. I've been working toward this my entire career. He genuinely felt untouchable. Since the night of the dinner party, his life had seemingly been perfect. Elena had vanished without a trace, no phone calls, no crying, no lawyers demanding alimony. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Julian had confidently filed the fraudulent quitclaim deed with the county, legally moving the $10 million Bel Air estate into Chloe's name. He was, in his own mind, the master of his universe. The family found their VIP seats in the very front row of the main conference hall, directly facing the massive, brightly lit stage. Julian wanted to be seen. He wanted the world to witness him with his beautiful new woman, his new status, his impending success. The house lights slowly dimmed. A hushed, expectant silence fell over the 3,000 attendees. The conference host, a distinguished older man with silver hair, stepped up to the crystal podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon." His voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We have an incredibly special keynote speaker today, a true industry titan." The crowd settled into their seats, murmuring with curiosity. "This individual has been operating in the absolute shadows of global real estate for over a decade," the host continued, his voice dramatic and reverent. "A mystery investor who has quietly acquired the most premium commercial and residential properties across the West Coast, Europe, and Asia. A phantom whose personal portfolio is valued at over $50 billion. Julian leaned forward in his plush velvet seat, his eyes wide with greedy intrigue. This was exactly the kind of player he desperately wanted to meet. If he could just get 5 minutes with this billionaire, he could secure the capital to launch his own megafirm. Today, this individual has chosen to finally step out of the shadows, the host announced, and reveal themselves to our global community. So, without further delay, please welcome the sole owner and CEO of the Vanguard Global Syndicate, Ms. Elena Vanguard." Julian frowned slightly. Elena. It was a common enough name, but hearing it sent a tiny, irrational prickle of unease down his spine. The massive 60-foot digital screen behind the stage flared to life, displaying a professional, high-definition portrait. The face on the screen was 30 feet tall, looking directly into the camera lens with an expression of absolute, cold-blooded confidence. The entire convention hall erupted in a collective gasp, but nobody gasped louder than Julian Thorne. The crystal glass of sparkling water in his hand slipped from his fingers, shattering loudly on the polished floor, the sound entirely lost beneath the deafening roar of 3,000 people reacting at once. Julian's face went bone white. All the blood drained from his head so fast he felt violently dizzy. His mouth hung open as his brain completely short-circuited, unable to process what he was seeing. Beside him, Chloe's smug, confident smile literally melted off her face, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. "Julian," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking. Is that your ex-wife?" Beatrice grabbed Julian's arm so hard her manicured nails dug painfully through his suit jacket. "Julian, that cannot be Elena. Tell me that is not her." But before Julian could even attempt to form a coherent denial, the stage lights flared, and I walked out onto the stage. There was no denying it. I was no longer the quiet, plain housewife they had mocked. I wore a sharply tailored, immaculate white power suit that fit as though it had been sculpted for a queen. My hair was styled flawlessly, framing my face with a sleek, intimidating edge. Stiletto heels echoed powerfully against the wooden stage with every step, and resting against my collarbone, perfectly visible against the stark white silk of my blouse, was a heavy antique emerald necklace, a piece of jewelry worth more than Julian's entire firm. I walked to the absolute center of the stage. My posture was ramrod straight, my head held high in total dominance. I looked out over the massive audience, my eyes scanning the sea of faces until they landed directly on the front row. I locked eyes with Julian. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked at him with the cold, absolute certainty of an apex predator who had been patiently waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice was clear, strong, devoid of any emotion. It echoed through the massive speakers, filling the room with terrifying authority. "Many of you don't know me," I continued smoothly. I preferred it that way. For the past decade, I've operated exclusively through proxy LLCs and shadow holding companies, keeping my name entirely out of public records. But today, I'm stepping forward. I paused, letting my gaze drift slowly over Julian's horrified, sweating face. Because my silence has finally served its purpose. Chapter 4: The Execution. I clicked a small black remote in my hand. The massive digital screen behind me instantly changed. A map of the United States appeared, rapidly populating with hundreds of glowing red pins spreading across major cities like a conquering army. I personally own and control over 400 premium commercial high-rises, I stated, my voice steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. I own 60 luxury residential complexes, 22 shopping centers, and massive stakes in international logistics. The crowd was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive hall. However, I said, my tone shifting into something slightly darker, there is one very specific, very small property I would like to discuss with you today. I clicked the remote again. The screen changed, displaying a high-definition photograph of the $10 million Bel Air estate, Julian's supposed kingdom. Julian choked back a gasp, looking around frantically as if searching for an escape route. This property, located at 1420 Bel Air Road, I announced, my voice carrying through the absolute stillness. Some of you local brokers may recognize it. It was illegally, fraudulently sold 2 weeks ago by a mid-level agent named Julian Thorne to a junior assistant named Chloe Davis for the sum of exactly $1. 3,000 pairs of eyes turned simultaneously to the front row. Julian wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor of the convention center to open up and swallow him whole. Chloe had already begun physically edging away from him in her seat, trying desperately to put distance between herself and the radioactive fallout. What, Mr. Thorne did not know, I continued, my tone almost conversational now, as if discussing a minor accounting error, is that I purchased this property in cash under a Vanguard Proxy LLC 3 years before we were ever married. The deed was always in my company's name. It was never his to sell. I looked directly at Chloe. The transaction he signed is entirely worthless. It is legally void. It is a federal felony. Chloe stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor. Her face was bright red with humiliation and rage. You told me you owned that house, Chloe hissed at Julian, her voice carrying clearly to the surrounding rows. You made me look like a complete idiot. She grabbed her designer purse and pushed past the shocked executives in her row, practically sprinting toward the nearest exit. The aggressive red dress that had made her look so confident 10 minutes earlier now made her look like a glowing target as she fled the room in disgrace. I watched her go, my expression entirely unbothered. Then I turned my attention back to Julian. But here's what makes this situation truly interesting, I said, clicking the remote to the next slide. The massive screen displayed the corporate logo of Sterling & Associates Real Estate, the prestigious firm where Julian served as senior vice president. Another click, and a barrage of complex acquisition documents and transfer of ownership ledgers appeared. I purchased that entire brokerage firm 3 days ago through one of my holding corporations, I announced coldly. Julian made a wretched, guttural sound, as if he'd just been punched in the stomach. His mother Beatrice clutched his arm, her proud, arrogant smile completely gone, replaced by sheer horror. Mr. Thorne, I said, looking down at him like a bug on the pavement, you are, as of this exact second, officially unemployed. You are fired for gross misconduct and corporate fraud. Julian's brother Leo suddenly stood up, his face twisted in angry, desperate denial. This is slander, Leo shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the stage. You can't just do this. I'm calling the police. Actually, Leo, I interrupted him smoothly, my eyes locking onto him, since we're publicly discussing property ownership, I should probably mention the building where your high-end restaurant operates on Sunset Boulevard. Leo froze, his hand dropping to his side. That is one of my buildings, I stated clinically. Your commercial lease expires in 30 days. I've decided not to renew it. The space has already been leased to a much more successful restaurant group. Leo sat down hard, as if his legs had given out beneath him. My gaze shifted down the row to Camila, Julian's sister, who had been desperately trying to. And Camila, I said softly, though the microphone carried the threat perfectly, your boutique on Rodeo Drive, that's my property as well. You're 3 months behind on rent. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before my security team physically removes your inventory. Camila looked like she might vomit, her face gone a sickly pale green, her hands shaking as she covered her mouth. I turned my full attention back to Julian. The entire convention center was holding its collective breath, watching a woman systematically and ruthlessly dismantle a man's entire life, his family, his future, with nothing but the cold, hard truth. "You told me I was a nobody, Julian," I said, my voice soft, but sharp enough to reach every corner of that massive room. "You told me I had no power, no family, nowhere to go. You told me I'd been living off you like a parasite." I paused, letting the silence crush him. "You were wrong on every single count." Chapter 5: The Standing Ovation. "I built an empire while you were busy building an ego," I continued, my voice echoing with terrifying finality. I looked down at the front row. Julian's face was wet with tears, a grown man, a supposed titan of industry, openly weeping in front of 3,000 of his peers. His entire world was collapsing around him in real time. His mother Beatrice was crying hysterically into her Chanel scarf. His siblings looked completely destroyed. "I never needed you, Julian," I said, my tone shifting from cold authority to a chilling, detached pity. "I chose you. I wanted to build a life with you where genuine love mattered more than a bank balance. But you taught me something incredibly valuable instead." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the crystal podium. "You taught me that love given to an arrogant, insecure narcissist is simply wasted energy." I clicked the remote one final time. The massive digital screen behind me went completely dark. "Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen," I said. For 3 seconds, the convention hall was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. And then the room erupted. It started with a few slow claps from the billionaire investors in the front rows, quickly swelling into a deafening, thunderous roar. 3,000 people surged to their feet, delivering a massive, unyielding standing ovation. They were cheering, whistling, applauding the woman who had just delivered the most brutal, flawless, and devastating keynote execution in the history of the real estate industry. I stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage with my head held high, my posture immaculate. I didn't look back at Julian. I didn't need to. I had said everything that needed to be said, and I had taken everything that needed to be taken. Julian remained in his velvet seat, entirely paralyzed. His family sat around him, looking as though they'd just been hit by a Category 5 hurricane. And somewhere in the back of Julian's shattered mind, through the deafening applause and the crushing devastation, one agonizing thought kept repeating on an endless loop: asterisk, how did I not see this? How did I not know, asterisk? The answer was agonizingly simple. He had been so entirely convinced of his own superiority, so utterly certain his wife was a plain, uneducated nobody, that he had never bothered to actually look at her. He had been so obsessively focused on what he wanted her to be, a quiet, subservient background character, that he never saw the $50 billion apex predator standing right in front of him. And now the bill had come due. Chapter 6: The Domino Purge. The weeks following the global summit were a masterclass in total, systematic ruination for the Thorne family. Julian tried calling me immediately after the conference. Every number he'd ever had for me was permanently disconnected or blocked at the carrier level. He drove to, but when he arrived, the massive iron gates were locked shut, and a detail of heavily armed private security contractors from Vanguard Trust stood posted at the entrance. They informed Julian that if he stepped 1 foot onto the pavement, he would be arrested for federal trespassing. He sent frantic, weeping emails. He wrote handwritten letters. All of them came back unopened, or were simply deleted. Chloe had blocked him on every platform the second she fled the convention center. Within a week, her social media was flooded with highly curated photos of her dining at expensive restaurants with much older, significantly wealthier men. She was living her best life, acting as though Julian Thorne had never existed. When Julian tried to approach her at a minor industry networking event a month later, hoping she might take pity on him, Chloe looked at him with such profound, visceral disgust that he physically recoiled. "You completely humiliated me," Chloe hissed coldly, stepping back as if he were carrying a contagious disease. "You made me look like a pathetic gold digger who tried to steal a house you didn't even own. You're a fraud, Julian. Don't ever speak to me again." Julian. First came the official termination email from his brokerage firm, no longer his firm. I owned the company now, and my newly appointed executive management team had decided to restructure. Julian was let go immediately, stripped of his severance package, his stock options, and his corporate health insurance, thanks to the pending fraud charges. Then came the eviction notice for his secondary luxury apartment in Santa Monica. It turned out Vanguard Trust owned that building too, and his month-to-month lease was abruptly terminated. His prized Porsche 911 was aggressively repossessed in the middle of the night when the bank called in the auto loan early, a bank that was, unsurprisingly, a minor subsidiary of my financial portfolio. Within 3 months, Julian Thorne had lost absolutely everything. His family suffered the exact same spectacular fate. Leo's high-end restaurant closed its doors exactly 30 days after the conference, just as I had promised. He couldn't find another commercial location he could afford without the heavily subsidized rent Julian used to secretly help him pay. The restaurant that had been Leo's pride, joy, and primary source of arrogant bragging was permanently boarded up. He was forced to move back into his childhood bedroom, at his mother's house, at 40 years old, bitter and utterly broken. Camila's designer boutique suffered the same brutal execution. She frantically tried to move her expensive inventory to a cheaper location, but the damage to her personal reputation was already fatal. A video of my keynote speech had leaked online and gone massively viral. The internet had mercilessly dubbed her the sister who mocked a billionaire. Clients canceled their appointments. Brands pulled their merchandise. Her business failed within 2 months, and she was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. She, too, had to move back home with Beatrice, 2 grown adults, completely ruined, living with their mother, all because they had loudly and proudly underestimated the wrong woman. Beatrice's downfall was perhaps the most ironic of all. She had to put her luxury Santa Monica condo up for sale. She'd been so proud of that place, frequently using it to host wealthy friends and brag about her genius son. But without Julian's illegal financial support, she couldn't afford the skyrocketing mortgage and the suddenly doubled HOA fees. Quietly, through a deeply buried proxy LLC, I had my team purchase the condo from her at a severely reduced, desperate price. I instructed my lawyers to offer Beatrice the chance to stay in the condo as a renter, paying me directly every month. But Beatrice was far too proud, and far too ashamed. She declined the offer, sold the property for pennies on the dollar to cover her mounting debts, and moved into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment across town, in a significantly less desirable neighborhood. The family that had joyfully celebrated Julian's cruelty at that dining room table now lived together in the suffocating squalor of the consequences. They barely spoke to each other anymore. There was too much blame to go around, too much venom, too much shame. But Julian's fall was the hardest of all. Chapter 7: The Ghost of Sunset Boulevard. Julian Thorne went from being a highly successful, aggressively arrogant senior vice president of luxury real estate to working the counter at a budget car rental agency at LAX. It was the only job he could secure without a rigorous background check into his pending federal fraud investigation. Wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform with a crooked plastic name tag, he spent his days enduring the complaints of exhausted tourists and angry businessmen. He'd been forced to move into a cramped, depressing 1-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood in the valley, the exact kind of neighborhood he used to drive through in his Porsche, locking his doors, feeling immensely superior to the people who lived there. His car was now a beat-up, 15-year-old Honda Civic that made a terrifying, grinding noise every time he accelerated. His clothes came from discount racks at big-box stores. His life had become the physical manifestation of everything he'd ever feared. One rainy evening, about 6 months after the global summit, Julian was walking past a high-end, Michelin-starred restaurant in West Hollywood. He'd just finished a 12-hour shift and was heading to a cheap taco stand nearby, because he couldn't afford to eat anywhere else. He stopped on the sidewalk, his collar turned up against the rain. Through the massive, warmly lit floor-to-ceiling window of the restaurant, he saw Chloe. She was sitting at a prime table, wearing a stunning black evening gown, her hair perfectly styled. Across from her sat a much older man in a bespoke tuxedo, looking at her with total adoration. Chloe was laughing, tossing her head back, reaching across the table to gently touch the older man's hand. She looked radiant, expensive, completely unbothered. The older man stood to go to the restroom. For one brief, agonizing moment, Chloe turned her head and looked out through the rain-streaked window. Her eyes met Julian's. Julian froze. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around his chest, a pathetic, desperate spark of recognition lighting up in his chest. Chloe stared directly at him for 3 long, devastating seconds. Her face was completely, terrifyingly blank, the exact look one might give a stranger panhandling on the street. There was no anger. There was no pity. There was only absolute, crushing indifference. Then she simply looked away. She picked up her crystal wine glass and took a slow sip, as if Julian Thorne had never existed at all. Julian stood in the rain, feeling smaller and more insignificant than he had ever felt in his entire life. He had lost absolutely everything: his career, his stolen money, his family's respect, his pride, his ego. And the 24-year-old woman he had thrown away his 5-year marriage for wouldn't even acknowledge his physical existence. He was completely, utterly alone. It was exactly what he had once loudly declared I would be. Chapter 8: The Empire Awakens. 1 year after the conference, the California sun shone brightly over a beautiful, newly constructed commercial building in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. I stood on the pristine front steps, wearing a sharply tailored, elegant cream-colored dress. Resting perfectly against my collarbone was the heavy antique emerald necklace my grandfather had left me. I looked peaceful. I looked happy. And for the first time in a decade, I looked entirely free. The polished brass sign above the heavy glass doors read, "The Arthur Vanguard Center for Women in Transition." A massive crowd had gathered for the opening ceremony: local residents, prominent community leaders, city officials, and dozens of women who would directly benefit from the center's services. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, stepping up to the microphone, my voice warm and commanding. "This center is named for my grandfather, Arthur Vanguard," I continued, looking out at the attentive crowd, "a man who taught me that real power is not about petty revenge. And it is certainly not about proving arrogant people wrong. True power is about building something that lasts, something that actually helps people. Something that matters." I gestured gracefully to the beautiful, state-of-the-art building behind me. "The Vanguard Center will provide vital, fully funded resources for women leaving incredibly difficult and abusive situations," I announced, my voice ringing with certainty. "Women who need intensive job training. Women who need a safe, beautiful place to start over. Women who need to remember that they are infinitely stronger than they've been led to believe." The crowd erupted into passionate applause. "My grandfather built staggering wealth from absolutely nothing," I said, smiling warmly. "And he taught me how to do exactly the same. Now I want to use that infrastructure to help other women build their own unshakable strength." As I cut the ceremonial red ribbon, the cameras flashed. My life had transformed completely over that year. I was no longer hiding behind shadow LLCs or pretending to be a quiet, invisible housewife. I ran my $50 billion empire openly and ruthlessly. I sat on the executive boards of major international corporations. I mentored brilliant young women in business, teaching them the brutal realities of commercial real estate investment, and how to build wealth that no man could ever touch. I dated occasionally, but carefully. I had learned a highly expensive, extremely painful lesson about giving my heart away too easily to men who only saw me as a stepping stone. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I found myself driving my armored black Range Rover past the Bel Air estate Julian and I used to share. I hadn't sold it. I hadn't bulldozed it. I had converted the massive, $10 million property into an exclusive, highly subsidized, luxury affordable housing complex for single mothers. I had completely gutted Julian's pretentious man cave and turned it into a state-of-the-art daycare facility. 6 beautiful, sprawling apartments where women could raise their children in a safe, pristine neighborhood surrounded by opportunity instead of poverty. I had kept the custom mahogany dining room exactly as it was, the exact room where Julian had tried to sell my life for a single dollar bill. But now, other women sat at that table. They cooked there, laughing loudly, making beautiful memories with their babies, building their own powerful stories over the very spot where my marriage had died. I pulled the Range Rover over to the curb for a moment and rolled down the tinted window, sitting there, looking at the house, feeling the warm California breeze on my face. I didn't think about Julian Thorne much anymore. He was merely a closed chapter in a very long book, a necessary, brutal lesson I had to learn. Sometimes the most painful, humiliating lessons are the most valuable ones you'll ever receive. Julian had taught me that I didn't need a single ounce of anyone else's validation. He had taught me to fiercely value myself, to violently protect my peace, and to deeply understand that when people show you exactly who they are, you must believe them immediately. I pulled out my phone and looked at a digital photo saved in my favorites, a picture of my grandfather, Arthur, taken 30 years earlier, standing proudly in front of his very first commercial high-rise. He was smiling, hands on his hips, looking like a man who owned the world. "I hope I made you proud, grandfather," I whispered into the quiet car. And somewhere, somehow, I knew he was smiling back, because he knew my story wasn't ultimately about revenge. It was about knowing my absolute worth. It was about building an impenetrable fortress in complete silence while the arrogant fools in the room laughed at me. It was about understanding that when people actively underestimate you, they are handing you the greatest strategic advantage in the world. They never see you coming. And by the time they realize who you truly are, it's already much, much too late. I put the Range Rover in drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving that house and those toxic memories permanently behind me in the rearview mirror. I had a massive corporate acquisition meeting in an hour, a mentoring session after that, and a quiet, luxurious dinner reservation at one of my favorite restaurants. My life was full. My empire was expanding. My future was terrifyingly bright. And as I merged onto the busy highway, heading toward whatever incredible challenge came next, I completely understood the final lesson my grandfather had tried to teach me all those years ago. You do not need to make noise to be powerful. You do not need to explain yourself to people who have already decided you are beneath them. You just need to know your own immense worth, and build your life accordingly. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who holds all the cards. Sometimes the person they mockingly throw $1 at is the one who owns the entire bank. I never needed to prove myself to Julian Thorne. I just needed to step back, remain silent, and let him prove exactly who he really was. If this story lit a fire in you, if you understand the quiet, immovable power of a woman who turns her silence into a weapon, hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, because the stories worth hearing are about the invisible women who refuse to stay down when the world pushes them to the floor. See you in the next one.